Consider This, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bale Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome back to UN Omaha and Consider This. My guests this week are, well, from an old haunt of mine, I guess you could say, the Communications Department at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Jeremy Lipschultz and Mike Hilt are professors of communication. Their specialty is in the broadcast journalism field. And they have recently published a book called Crime and Local Television News, and the subtitle Dramatic Breaking and Live from the Scene. Now it's geared toward I guess a college audience. It has those nice discussion questions at the end of every chapter. But I think your research is what's interesting, and I think what you try to address is a question I have been asked, or several questions I have been asked every speech I've given for the last 20 years. Jeremy, what were you trying to do in this book?
We were trying to understand a little bit about why crime is such an important part of news for local television stations.
Even dominant would probably be a good
and
descriptor.
we've known this for a couple of decades, that it's probably the largest chunk of time spent in a newscast over the course of time to crime stories. And we wanted to better understand, was it the commercial pressure or something else?
And being broadcast news veterans yourself, I'm sure you've been on the side mic where,
right.
If you know the old "if it bleeds, it leads." I mean, all those cliche kinds of things that we've heard many times in newsrooms across the country.
Well, in an earlier life, I was a news producer, and I heard all of those things. And in fact, in the market where I worked, you really looked for a story that would capture the attention, the imagination of your audience. Most of the time, that would have been a local story, and quite often it was a spot news story, a violent story, a crime story, something with a lot of lights, bells and whistles, noise, police involvement, that kind of thing.
There's a lot of reasons, just from my experience, that I could say that this happens. But did you find anything in your research of looking at all the tapes? And there were how many markets that you looked at in a window of time?
Initially, about 24 markets. We looked at tapes from those for a 1-week period. And then we also had survey data nationally from broadcast newsrooms.
And we should say that these are different sized markets. You've got larger markets and medium sized markets, including Omaha,
Right.
in your list. And local news you do for a reason, because local is different than national. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but it really is, isn't it?
Well,
when it comes to the decisions. And
I think that the times are changing that, but right. Initially the local station is geared for its local audience, and it wants to have news that people can relate to, that they're familiar with, that when you mention a story and it happens at 90th and Dodge, they know where 90th and Dodge is. They've been through that intersection many times.
Yeah, maybe every morning or every
Right.
afternoon, or...
And so they can picture it, they can relate to it, and so they want to know more about it.
One of the things in local news is that you always try to lead local for that very reason. But the capability of going live that came in the early 70s and then progressed to the point where it's just a mainstay, the capability to move and transmit very quickly, and then the pressure to use that live capability so that you seem so up to date in every newscast as many times as possible. Do you think that has an effect on how you choose or lead with violence and crime?
Well, we see examples of stories today in newscasts where a newscast will lead with a live shot, say at 10 o'clock, and the story's been over for 4 or 5 hours.
Live for the sake of live.
Right. And it might be a crime story, it might be a city council story, it could be any type of story, but because the station wants that to be the live story and the lead story, they'll go live with it at 10 o'clock even though it's been over for a period of time.
Okay, let me play viewer instead of news person for a while. And you just come back at me, either one of you, with whatever your academic and or personal reaction is, and it's probably going to be a mix of that. Why is there so much violence on TV? Why do they always show so much blood? And you know, I'm so scared. I mean, my city is just not safe.
Well, let's talk first about the 10 o'clock newscast, because we spent a lot of time looking at that newscast. Those producers are looking for what's new, what's different since 6, so we can report something that's different.
And that's a really important thing to differentiate those newscasts and to make them fresh.
And because of that, crime is often the story that is news. Government begins to shut down, other things pretty much wind down as the day winds down, but in the evening, there are things going on in the city. And so those stories get played for that reason, because they can be played as breaking news, and because there is a certain dramatic element to having that reporter live out at the scene in the dark, reporting what's going on.
But there's so much crime. I sit there and I go, there's crime everywhere. Every night I turn on crime. Is the city safe? Is my community safe? Is the order of my city in jeopardy?
During the 1990s, when we did most of our study for this book, crime was on decline nationally.
But the perception, because of if it bleeds, it leads, and might give us that false sense that it is, especially for our older viewers. I've noticed that as a...
Yeah, right. And you know, you mentioned trying to make that 10 o'clock newscast different than the 6 o'clock newscast. It used to be that I thought I was unusual. Since I worked in television, I would remember stories from like the 5 and the 6 and the 10, and so I would know, you know, they ran that story at 6. In fact, I think they used the same script because I would remember. Now I'm not so sure that I'm different. I think the viewers are more in touch with TV. They've seen so much of it and they watch so much of it that they can tell. And so I think the stations then are caught in a bind. They have to make sure that their 10 o'clock is different from the 5 and the 6 because people will know.
Well, they have some pretty decent research. I mean, you can say what you want about consultants and research, but I mean, there are proper ways to do research, as you know, because you do research. And there's been some pretty good research to show that people do notice or feel that's old hat and flip. If it looks like you're repeating, not verbatim, but the pictures, the style, close to the, you know, the 5, the 6, or in Channel 6's case in Omaha, for instance, the 4 o'clock. So, you know, that little clicker is a pretty powerful tool, and that's had some effect on that.
Right. And I know in my house, it's used, I don't know how many remotes we've gone through, and just wearing them out. But
well, are there more men in your family? That might have something to do with it.
Well, that might be part of the problem.
The Lord is punishing me with a cough for making a sexist comment. But I mean, it's a little different world than when people used to be married to kind of to one station, you know, in their heart and soul for a long time.
It is disappointing, though, Carol, that survey data has shown that people also turn to the local television news stations for national and international news. And we found quite clearly that that was regularly and systematically avoided.
Well, I want to get to that because I think that's really important. And not even just the national news, but the national context of local stories, and how you fit into the whole, the fabric, and then also more in-depth coverage. And I want to talk a little bit, well, I'll bring it up now. You mentioned one of your chapters in your book, and we should say, and it's been said so many times, but just in case you haven't heard, the majority of Americans get most of their news from television, for better or for worse. So that's, you know, I think that's, so it's worth discussing. But you talked about executions, coverage of executions, and you focused on Nebraska because we had resumed our executions at this particular time period that you were looking at during, you know, and that was a pretty big deal.
Yes.
Just from a news point of view and from an interest point of view. You know, the first executions, there were 3 of them sort of close together since Charles Starkweather.
Right.
I don't think there was a story that didn't say that, the first execution. Right. So what did you find?
Well, we pointed out the differences. I think we talked in that chapter, we began by giving a recap, a brief history of the Starkweather murder spree, capture, and then execution, and talked about how television covered that, which compared to how it would cover it now is just, if something like that, well, I mean, we can compare that maybe to the sniper case from the East Coast in terms of coverage. If something like Starkweather were to happen now, you would have all of the national media here. With the 24-hour news networks, they would be covering that wall to wall. You would have very little else on their broadcast, but the local stations would be covering it in much the same way. They would be everywhere. They would be devoting most, if not all, of their resources to something like that. Back when Starkweather took place in the late 50s, 59, you had the search for him, the travel across state, ultimate capture in Wyoming, and not much of that made it into newscasts, except for the brief glints of him as he pulls up in the police car and is taken into the
They didn't
courthouse.
have
no live capabilities.
No live capabilities, and the black and white film they
Right.
had to come back from the distance, be physically driven or whatever, and run through a film processor,
Right.
and it was very cumbersome and timely, time-consuming process.
And then you fast forward to the executions in Nebraska that took place in the 90s. You have live shots from the penitentiary, shot on videotape, color. The editing process reduced from the hours it would have taken to get the film ready to go and first back into the building to really a matter of minutes, because you can send the video back via satellite, have it edited and turned around in a short period of time, and even quicker if you've shot it correctly in the order that you would edit it. So that right there, a huge difference. And it was played up. I mean, the passage of time, the notoriety that Starkweather brought to not only the state, but just to the capital punishment process, all of that played into those executions that took place in Nebraska in the 90s.
One of the things that was interesting is that Nebraska sort of learned its lesson, or at least the powers that be, after two pretty, the first two executions were Harold Walkin' Willie, was his nickname, Otay, and John Joubert.
Right.
Both, one a very heinous, awful murder of a young woman, and then of course the John Joubert case where these young boys were killed in not that there's a good way to kill a young boy, but a very horrible way. Those took place in the evening, were fodder for the 10 o'clock news. Well, all four newscasts leading up to it, and the 10 o'clock news was almost like the big climax, and then it would be midnight, and then they'd probably come back and say, yeah, they did kill him. They learned a valuable lesson, I think, from that, and the third execution actually did not happen at night.
It made a huge
TV had an effect on that. It must have.
It made a huge difference, in part because of television, but I think also in part because of what was going on in the capital city. There was this almost carnival-like atmosphere that surrounded those two executions. And of course, Nebraska was and continues to be one of the last states that uses the electric chair. And that becomes a powerful symbol in this process.
Mm-hmm. It's a hot button in the whole issue that is a very contentious issue anyway. One of the things that you did mention in your book, and I don't remember if it was your opinion or what, is that we in the broadcast media, because I worked during that time, did not probably use that to carry on a meaningful and in-depth discussion of capital punishment, one that is still going on in this state almost even as we speak.
Because news is often what is breaking and timely and what is happening now, we find that is typically the case, that we rarely do see it as a forum, particularly in the broadcast context and particularly in television news, for really serious discussion of public affairs. That would take too much time. That would involve a process that we're not typically seeing in local television news.
You know, time is the issue. And if you look at a typical newscast, let's take a 6 o'clock. It's a little different at 10 now that you go to 10:35, so you have that extra 5 minutes. But a typical 6 o'clock, you would think, looking at the face of it, well, you've got 30 minutes. Well, no, you don't really.
No.
As
a producer,
no.
you know.
I know
Exactly
Right.
The commercial hole, the news
That's it.
hole, the chit-chat hole.
And if you take the time, which you really don't start even with 30, you start with a little less than 30, and then you subtract all the commercials. And then you take out weather, and then you take out sports, and then you take out the pre-show tease and the bumps between segments and all of that, and maybe you're left with 9-10 minutes of news. Okay, so now if you've got a lead story, that's a huge lead story that you're going to go live with, well, you can't devote just a minute to that. It's a live story that's the lead story. You're going at least 2, maybe a little bit more than that. And then you might have other stories that you feel you have to air. Maybe something happened at the school board meeting or the city council, so you feel like you have to get that into the newscast. And when it's all said and done,
complimentary. We've got a health story,
right?
Or
Those features,
those features, and maybe
right.
something really cute and warm and fuzzy
to close the newscast with,
Right.
because you've just told them all about all of these crime
Awful
stories,
things.
and you need something nice at the end. And when it's all said and done, then you really don't have all of the time in the world to devote to a topic that really deserves a lot of time.
Right, and news departments are income generators, and they have X number of commercials that are sold for a premium price, and those are sacrosanct, and everything else kind of. Plus, you have a bunch of reporters and photographers that have been running their little buns off all day, and productivity is an important issue.
Well, this might be news to viewers, but if you're in a newscast and you're running out of time, it's not the commercials that get dropped to get back on time. Because, for example, at 10 o'clock, if we have to hit a national program at 10:35, pick your favorite network, it doesn't really matter. We have to be there.
And every one of those commercials had to have aired.
At 10:35,
Or somebody's on the line.
and you air the commercials. So to make sure you do that, if something has to be dropped to get there on time, it's usually a story. Or you
And-
cut weather a little bit, or
Right.
sports, but
Yeah,
something like that.
If it's
it's
okay,
content.
they can give a little weather. I always remember, can you give us 15? Can you give it?
Right.
Not tonight. But the thing is, let's go back up to the beginning of that newscast. That live breaking news story that is so often at 10 o'clock involving, and it could be the weather. It could be something like people crashing into people, but that's stuff that happens. Or an update on something that happened, that's usually a crime and often violent, because it has that live intro and outro, and then it has the meat in it. It's by its nature longer and takes more time.
Right.
So the weight of it becomes, I think that's an important issue. The weight you give stories has an overall effect on how people leave that newscast.
We should say, too, that in this book we are a little sympathetic to the bind the television news people are in. We've seen some experiments. There was one a couple of years ago in Chicago where they really tried to break out of this mold and do more public affairs, more long-form journalism, and they didn't get the ratings. It didn't last. So I think on the one hand, news people see these limitations in the newsroom, but they don't quite know how to fashion a way out of that box.
And it is tough. Sometimes, though, stations will, and as a producer, and you hate having those few extra seconds that are taking and teasing another newscast, but they will try to flesh it out a little differently or give it a little more breadth. There are efforts made, but it is tough when you have this potpourri of things going on during the day, and it's kind of a crapshoot sometimes when you send bodies out to cover these stories if it's going to pan out, and then rearranging people. It's pretty crazy, folks.
There was a newscast last Friday in Kansas City, and I read about this from the Kansas City newspaper, and I have to throw it was from my former television station. Unfortunately, now they're in third place, so they felt like they had to roll the dice and try something new. They devoted most of the news program, their 10 o'clock news, to high school football. They led the newscast with high school football, and it lasted 25 minutes. Then they did, in the last 10 minutes, now I'm generalizing because, again, they ran commercials, so you have to deduct that from all that. The last 10 minutes they did the rest of the news of the day and weather, and that was it. So they didn't even do news off the top. They did high school football.
Well,
for the
we've
first
done that
25
with Nebraska football
Well,
many a Saturday.
And,
that is
and
a
that's
crapshoot.
unique. Yeah, and they were trying something different. And then they had the overnight ratings, because in Kansas City they can get those.
They're a big market.
And they had a bump. They had a little increase. They didn't catch the first two, but they got closer. And so that might be something more that you'll see, some of those longer form. But the example from Chicago, they tried that for several months, I believe, and it just didn't work out.
One of the things that you point out is that the other experimentation is being done. I think you talked about a KGUN in Arizona. I forget which market KGUN is in. Tucson?
It's Tucson.
Yeah.
They took a little different approach. Instead of trying to just say we're going to make overall changes in our content, they had adopted a viewer's Bill of Rights.
Viewers' Bill of Rights.
I thought this was one of the most interesting things, not just for the viewer's sake, but to constantly keep in front of the reporters and the assignment editors. Tell me a little bit about that.
There has been this movement around the country. It began in the newspaper world in
Right.
places like Des Moines and Madison,
Community,
Wisconsin.
type of
Civic journalism is the label that's used. And some newsrooms have picked up on this idea that, maybe we're a little too isolated, maybe we're a little too insular, and we need to find better ways to allow our viewers to tell us what they think. You said off the top, a lot of viewers say, gee, this is too much crime. And in fact, there's some survey data that shows that indeed some viewers do turn away from news that is too saturated with the crime. And so what these folks are trying to do is to find structures, systems in which the organization of the newsroom regularly has contact with people in the community through town hall meetings, through email, through any means that they can to get people to critique what they're doing, tell them what they're doing well and what they're not doing so well.
And one of the stories you pointed out was, instead of just kind of carrying the story where people were, I think it was an EP, allegedly they were going to shut down some water wells in a community because the EPA allegedly said there was a radon problem. And they went a little beyond that, and it's really just good reporting. And they said that one of the things in their Bill of Rights was solution-oriented reporting. And they did a little digging and found out that the problem wasn't that bad, and the city council kind of had to back off of this. We're going to close these wells, because obviously they were trying to make a point about government encroachment and local issues. But maybe there's still that. We're still trying to do the same thing we always tried to do. We just need to kind of refocus, redefine. And so some of these things, maybe they appear to be gimmicks, but maybe it's just a way to.
Well, Forrest Carr, the news director who came up with the Bill of Rights, says exactly it cannot be a gimmick if it's going to work. He was afraid, actually, that some stations would pick up this idea and turn it into a gimmick. But he really believed that his newsroom could be more responsive with,
now, did they
this
get
kind
ratings?
of system. They did get ratings, and it worked for them, and I believe that it's working for them as well in Orlando. So they're trying something different. There is still the problem of the need for video, and at what point do reporters and producers and management say, gee, this is really dramatic video, but maybe it's not what we should be throwing at our viewers?
I'll tell you, I watched the whole thing with a sniper on Fox and CNN, and pictures are the reason that people watch TV. And if you're, like I said, and I mentioned this before the show, if you go to the water cooler the next day and your station didn't have those pictures, I'm not talking about blood and gore and body bags, but wasn't on the scene and had the pictures, that's one little mark against you in that viewer's mind. I mean, how do we grapple with this devil that is television news?
Well, that's what sets it apart. I mean,
Right,
it
it's
is.
defining.
It is video. And, you're in the newsroom and you send the reporter out to do a story, and the phone call comes back, or a cell phone, or a two-way, and we're here, we're getting it. If it's not the first question, it's shortly thereafter. What kind of video do you have?
What's your best video?
Yeah, and do you have it, and how quickly can you get it back? Describe it. If you're on a phone, you say, well, tell me about it.
Because you're sitting there as a producer writing the teases right there.
And you're in your mind, you're thinking, okay, this is great. I can get this set up. Let's go with that. Get it back to me as soon as you can. When we watch primetime programming at night and we see the little teases dropped in throughout the evening for the local newscast at 10. If there's video there that's going to hook us, there's a reason it's called a tease. That's to make us watch at 10. Not to give the whole story away, but just to capture us and drag us
Suck
in.
in.
That's right.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to turn you totally into what you are, is the mentors and instructors of tomorrow's journalists. So given everything that you know, all the research that you've done, all the research that you've read, and having lived and eaten and breathed, broadcast journalism at some point, what do you tell your students headed into this? And there are a phenomenal number of students that you're dealing with.
We teach in the College of Arts and Sciences in the Department of Communication from a liberal arts perspective. And what we believe is that you prepare the future broadcasters, future journalists, by preparing them with as much knowledge as you can give them about the world and its history, and hope that they use that to take steps to report with more context, to report with more compassion, to report with more depth.
In a book like this, Crime and Local Television News, Dramatic, Breaking, and Live from the Scene, I read it, I tried to read it with the eyes that I would have read a book when I was studying journalism here. And it gave me food for thought, and I'm sure that any discussion in a classroom that would go with this. That ethics will be talked about, codes of ethics, and we can only hope, because it's not going to get any better out there in the competitive world of broadcast journalism.
No, and there are going to be many more outlets for what they do and their work. Within the context of our major, beyond the liberal arts scope, in surveys that we've done, we also stress the writing skills. They have to be able to write.
Oh, that's a whole other show.
That's, well, good, we can come back. And oral and communication skills. Be able to write, be able to deliver, and have it in a presentable fashion so people can understand what you're trying to say and what your point is.
I want to thank you guys for coming here today. And I'm very proud of the department that I came out of, and I think you're doing a wonderful job. Have a lot of students that you're educating. Jeremy Lipschultz, Dr. Jeremy Lipschultz, Dr. Michael Hill of the Communications Department of UNO. The book again is Crime and Local Television News, Dramatic, Breaking, and Live from the Scene. You can get it on Amazon, I checked. And it's worth a read if you're concerned about these issues. You can see this show and any past show on unotv.unomaha.edu. So check us out there or come back next week. Thanks for joining us.